Two titans clashed in public. One tweet. Two names the world never imagined in open war, Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And standing between them wasn't a CEO or a general or a pundit. It was J.D. Vance. $200 billion in influence collided with the weight of one man's silence. For days he said nothing. Not because he was weak, but because he knew that picking a side meant watching the country tear at the seams. But silence has a price. And eventually, someone asked him, "Where do you stand?" What followed wasn't a press release. It wasn't a headline. It was something rarer. Loyalty without noise. Some stories asked to be told not because they happened exactly this way, but because they could have. This is not a documentary. It's a story, told with imagination, but rooted in the emotional truths we all recognize. The characters are real, the moments are fictionalized, and the questions they raise, timeless. Inspired by public lives, reimagined to explore private choices, this is not a record, but a mirror. In a time when power collides and allegiance becomes a weapon. If this were you, what would you have done? Stay with us. Because in a world demanding sides, one man chose something rarer. Conviction. J.D. Vance lands in D.C. late at night. His aide hands him a phone. Elon Musk's tweet is on screen, implying Trump is tied to Epstein. J.D. stares blankly. This just detonated the next 5 months of American politics. It was 11:42 p.m. when the wheels of the government jet touched down on the wet tarmac at Reagan National. From the window, Washington, D.C. looked like a city under sedation. Dim orange streetlights reflecting off rainy asphalt, silent monuments cloaked in mist. But the quiet wouldn't last. J.D. Vance unbuckled his belt, blinked at the overhead light, and grabbed his duffel. The plane door hissed open. The night air slapped his face. Thick, metallic. The kind of humidity that made your suit feel one size tighter. His aide, Connor, was already at the base of the steps, holding a phone out like it was radioactive. "Don't check Twitter yet," Connor said. J.D. took it anyway. The screen glowed. The tweet was simple, brutal. A digital grenade lobbed into the heart of the GOP. Real Donald Trump is in the Epstein files. That's why they are still sealed. Have a nice day. At Elon Musk. There was no image, no follow-up, just silence from the world's richest man, a silence louder than any speech. J.D. didn't blink, didn't move. The rain pattered against the roof of the waiting Suburban. Connor broke it. He posted that 23 minutes ago. It already has 41 million views. Fox is live. CNN cut back into their programming. J.D. inhaled slowly. "He actually said it," Connor nodded. "And he hasn't taken it down." The car doors clicked shut. The engine hummed low, like a whisper. J.D. leaned back in the leather seat, the glow of the tweet still burning in his vision like an afterimage. They hadn't spoken in weeks. Elon and Trump. Last J.D. heard, they'd both cooled off after the last trade spat. There were supposed to be private back channels. They were supposed to play the same game. This wasn't a move. This was a declaration. "Where's the president now?" J.D. asked. "Mar-a-Lago, private dining room. We've been told not to call unless you say the word." J.D. didn't respond. His mind was already sprinting through donor reactions, media cycles, implications for pending legislation, Senate hearings, foreign policy blowback. All from 14 words typed in a Tesla somewhere between ego and war. He read the tweet again. What kind of man fires that shot and walks away from the blast? The car pulled onto the freeway. Washington rose in the distance. Its domes and spires lit faintly through fog, like a city that had no idea it was already on fire. "Set up a quiet room for me," J.D. said. "No cameras, no staff, just one screen and the list." Connor hesitated. "You think it's real?" J.D. didn't answer. He just muttered, more to himself than anyone else. This just detonated the next 5 months of American politics. Then softer. "Maybe more." His phone buzzed. Unknown number. No caller ID. Just a dot flashing on the screen like a warning light. He didn't pick up. Not yet. Because in that moment, J.D. Vance wasn't just riding through D.C. at midnight. He was entering the eye of a political storm. And something about that tweet wasn't just a rumor. It was personal. The line crackled for half a second before it picked up. West Wing Situation Line. J.D. didn't need to identify himself. The voice on the other end already knew. Senator, we were expecting your call. J.D. kept his voice low. Is he awake? He's in the private dining room. Been there since the tweet. No one's gone in yet. That told him everything. Trump had seen it, but he hadn't said a word. Not on Truth Social, not to staff, not even a press whisper. For a man who could tweet in his sleep, that silence was a tactical red flare. J.D. leaned forward in the back seat as the Suburban passed beneath a line of dark overpasses. The city outside was still half asleep, but inside the White House, the nerves were already raw. Who's in the room? He asked. A pause, then, Jason Miller. Hope. Byron. Navarro came in hot. Nobody's talking policy. Phones are locked down. They're waiting for him to make a move. J.D. rubbed his temple. The problem wasn't just that Elon had fired the first shot. It was that Trump hadn't responded yet. The longer he stayed silent, the more the world filled the gap with theories, panic, and poison. And if Trump chose to answer the tweet, there was no middle ground, no wink and smile. It would be war, in all caps, at 3 a.m. Patch me into Navarro, now. There was static, a shuffle of movement, and then a half-muffled voice. J.D., you seeing this circus? Yeah, J.D. said. I'm in it. You want to know what's happening? Navarro's voice was sharp. We're bleeding donors by the hour. The phones are melting. Fox won't stop looping it. We got campaign chairs asking if we're compromised. And the president's just sitting there. J.D. didn't need a briefing. He needed clarity. Is anyone telling him not to respond? Navarro let out a frustrated exhale. You think that's what he wants to hear right now? J.D. closed his eyes for a second. Listen, you need to buy me 15 minutes. Keep them distracted. Don't let him post. I'll be there in 20. You want me to stop the most impulsive communicator in human history from going nuclear while we wait for your Uber? J.D.'s voice dropped to almost a whisper. Just don't let him answer Musk. Not yet. Not this way. He hung up before Navarro could argue. The car was already weaving through Capitol traffic. Connor looked over from the front seat, nervous. They're expecting blood, sir. J.D.'s jaw tightened. They'll get it if he reacts emotionally. And if that happens, Musk wins. He stared out the window. The White House rose ahead in the distance, a cold white silhouette behind layers of fencing and floodlights. Inside, one man paced. Millions waited. And the country, once again, was held hostage by a few unsaid words. J.D. knew the president's instinct was to punch back, to reclaim dominance, to make the world remember who set the rules. But J.D. also knew something else. If this turned into a public brawl, there would be no winner, only wreckage, institutions, alliances, re-election hopes, the country itself. The silence, for now, was holding everything together. And J.D. Vance, former Marine, current senator, and reluctant referee between tech and power, whispered into the stillness, more to the man he once campaigned for than anyone else. Please don't answer him, sir. Not this way. The car slowed near 17th Street, headlights washing over barricades and wet asphalt, but J.D.'s mind had already drifted, away from the White House, away from the now viral tweet, and back to a night when none of this had happened yet. Back to the first time Elon Musk called him, not as a rival, not as a headline, but as a man trying to understand the country he was suddenly part of. It was just after 1 a.m., 3 months earlier. J.D. had been in his D.C. apartment, half asleep on the couch, tie loosened, a half-read budget report still open on his chest. The call came in from a Palo Alto number, unfamiliar but persistent. He almost ignored it. Senator Vance? The voice had asked, low, almost uncertain. J.D. sat up. Who's this? It's Elon. Musk. I hope this isn't the wrong time. It is, J.D. had said automatically, then paused. But I'm listening. There was a silence, then a long exhale. I can't sleep. I've been running models in my head for hours. Political, not engineering. JD had chuckled despite himself. That's a first. Elon didn't laugh. Is DC broken? Honestly, I need to know. Not the press version, the real one. JD had walked to the window, staring out over a quiet Constitution Avenue. It's not broken, it's just allergic to risk, and allergic to truth if the truth costs them votes. Elon's voice grew tighter. I tried to work within the system. I talked to your people. I backed Trump's tariffs. I sat through 5 hours of DOJ meetings about AI regulations. I kept thinking, maybe if I just explain the logic. They don't want logic, JD had interrupted. They want control. Silence again, then softer. I thought Trump got it. JD had nodded, unseen. He does, but even he can't drain the swamp when half the swamp has press credentials. That made Elon laugh, dry, bitter. You're the only one who says that out loud, you know. JD had leaned against the cold glass. Maybe that's why I sleep as badly as you do. They'd talked for nearly 40 minutes that night about taxes, innovation, grid failures, the future of manufacturing. JD had tried to assure him that fighting from inside the machine was still possible. Elon had ended the call with one line that stuck harder than any data point. Just tell me when I stop being an ally and start being a liability. JD never answered. And maybe that was the first mistake. Now, months later, as the car inched closer to the gates of the White House, JD couldn't shake that memory. Not because he missed Elon's optimism, but because somewhere between that late-night call and tonight's tweet, something had cracked. Elon hadn't always been a disruptor for sport. He believed once that power could be reasoned with. That if you moved fast enough, built big enough, and spoke boldly enough, Washington would catch up, or at least listen. But DC had done what it always did, dismissed him until it feared him. Then tried to box him in, and now he wasn't knocking on the door anymore. He was burning the map. JD shifted in his seat, the echo of that first call still pulsing like a heartbeat. It wasn't always war, but tonight, it was something close. And the part that kept JD Vance up wasn't that Elon had turned on Trump. It was that maybe, just maybe, he felt he had no one left to call. The hallway leading to the West Wing was colder than usual, not in temperature, but in silence. No small talk from aides, no hurried typing behind glass doors. Just the slow, echoing click of JD's shoes on polished tile as two Secret Service agents escorted him toward the private corridor. Outside, dawn hadn't yet broken. Inside, the air already felt like it belonged to a different day. One history books would footnote with exclamation marks and footnotes of disbelief. A senior staffer opened the last door without a word. Inside the room, deep carpets, the smell of burnt coffee, a muted TV casting silent headlines across the wall. The room wasn't full, but the gravity made it feel like it was collapsing inward. Jason Miller was at the far end, pacing in tight circles. Hope Hicks sat, jaw clenched, arms crossed. Navarro leaned against the mantel, trying to look calm but failing. Nobody spoke. All eyes turned to the man now stepping through the door. J.D. Vance. He said nothing. Neither did the president, at first. Trump was standing beside a long oak side table. On top of it, laid neatly, was a single sheet of paper. Printed, trimmed at the margins. Clean. The tweet. Not a screenshot. Not a news article. The actual tweet, typed out in 14-point Georgia, double-spaced, and set squarely in the center of the page, like a piece of evidence in a courtroom. JD stopped 3 paces in. Trump didn't look at the paper. He looked only at JD. You told me he was solid, Trump said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even anger. It was worse. It was disappointment. JD held his ground. He was. Trump nodded slowly, eyes never blinking. Then what the hell is this? JD looked down at the tweet, the black ink crisp against white. There was no logo, no profile picture, just words and their consequences. He snapped, JD said quietly. Too many closed doors, too many games. He's not used to being dismissed. That makes 2 of us, Trump muttered. A beat of silence passed. Then Navarro spoke, sharp and impatient. Sir, we need a response. Before the market opens. before the evening cycle. If we let this linger, I'm not interested in what we need right now. Trump cut him off without raising his voice. He looked back to JD. Tell me the truth. Is he bluffing? Does he actually have something? JD paused, then answered with the honesty Trump had once told him he respected. I don't know, but if he did, this isn't how he'd leak it. Elon doesn't toss dirt. He drops payloads. Trump walked to the window. The blinds were half closed, letting in thin slices of light. He stood there, back to the room, hands behind his back like a man rehearsing history before it happened. I built towers, JD, he said finally. He builds rockets. But I was here first. I know how this town burns people, and I know how to outlast it. JD took a cautious step forward. Then outlast it. Don't feed it. Trump didn't answer. He just turned slowly, walked back to the table, picked up the page with the tweet, and folded it in half, precisely without tearing, and placed it in the inner pocket of his jacket. No speech, no tweet, just silence. But everyone in the room knew what it meant. The match had been lit, the fuse was burning, and the President of the United States had just decided, at least for now, not to throw gasoline on it. Whether that was restraint or strategy, no one could say. JD exhaled slowly, shoulders tense. The room didn't relax. It never really would. No one moved. The paper was gone, folded, hidden, absorbed into the suit of the man who might still decide to burn the world with it later. But the presence of that tweet hadn't left the room. It was lingering in the air like smoke after a match is snuffed out. Thin, invisible, but inescapable. JD glanced around. Navarro was fuming. Hope Hicks was expressionless. Jason Miller looked like a man trying to calculate spin before a headline even dropped. Only Trump remained unreadable, seated now in a high-backed chair like a judge who'd seen too many cases of betrayal to be shocked by one more. JD stepped forward, slow and measured. Mr. President, he said carefully, this isn't a betrayal, not the way it looks. Trump didn't react, but JD kept going. I've spoken with him, many times. Elon doesn't think like the rest of this town. He doesn't signal through channels. He doesn't wait for permission. When he hits send, it's not war, it's frustration, it's emotion. You know that better than anyone. Navarro scoffed under his breath. That emotion just handed CNN a week of oxygen. JD ignored him. His eyes stayed on Trump. He's angry. He's been cornered. Regulation talks stalled. Media keeps taking shots at his companies, and half the cabinet leaks like a sieve. He doesn't see the system as broken. He sees it as rigged. Trump's lips barely moved. So do I. JD nodded. Then you know where he's coming from. There was a beat. Then Trump looked up at him, finally. You trying to defend him? JD hesitated, then answered with the one thing that had kept him useful in this room. Truth. I'm trying to explain him, so we don't mistake a blowtorch for a betrayal. A long silence. Then Trump leaned back, eyes sharp. He made his choice. JD didn't flinch. Trump's voice was low but final. Now we make ours. No one dared speak after that. Even Navarro stayed quiet. For a few heavy seconds, the only sound in the room was the low hum of a vent above the fireplace and the occasional creak of leather as someone shifted uneasily in their seat. JD felt the temperature shift, not literally but in posture, in perception. The air in the room no longer held him as an ally interpreting another ally's panic. It held him now as someone dangerously close to standing in the middle. That was the loneliest place in D.C. Trump stood. He wasn't done, but he'd said enough. I want every memo Elon's ever been CC'd on, he said to no one in particular. Anything with AI, subsidies, the works, I want it printed, sorted, and ready by tonight. If he wants to escalate, we'll be ready. Hope finally spoke. Sir, do you want to issue a statement? Trump didn't even turn to look. No, not yet. Then he looked once more at JD, not with anger, but with a kind of political weariness, like a man used to being the sun, now staring at a moon that dared reflect light. Emotion or not, he said, you don't go public unless you're willing to go all the way. JD said nothing. He had no defense left that wouldn't sound like a plea. The president turned away, and just like that, the room fractured. Not with shouting, not with scandal, but with silence that meant one thing. Lines had been drawn. The hallway outside the Roosevelt room was narrower than JD remembered. Or maybe it just felt that way now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Connor met him mid-stride, eyes alert. They want you on cable, tonight. JD didn't slow his pace. Define they. Communications team, fundraising arm, RNC chair, and… Connor hesitated. Jason says it's what the president expects. JD stopped. The moment had arrived. He knew it would come sooner or later. That line from Trump, "Now we make ours," it hadn't been metaphor. It had been marching orders. "Let me guess," JD said. "They want me to go on air and torch Elon." Connor didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew what this was. Not a policy defense, not a clarification. It was a signal. Loyalty, public and performative. Denounce the tweet. Question Elon's state of mind. Suggest ulterior motives. Discredit the messenger, and by extension, disarm the message. JD walked again, slower now. "You know, I've spent years telling voters I don't play that game." Connor matched his pace, "which is exactly why they think it'll work. If you say it, it lands harder. It doesn't sound like politics, it sounds like truth." JD let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. "You want truth? Here's one. If I go on air and do what they want, I'm no longer the man Elon called that night. And if I refuse, I'm no longer the man Trump trusts." They reached the small holding room off the west wing, a green room for urgent optics. Inside was a blank backdrop, a single camera, and a chair already positioned under soft, flattering lights. It smelled faintly of hairspray and tension. Connor held out the earpiece. "We go live in 20. They'll feed you the anchors. You've got 4 minutes, enough time to say everything without saying too much." JD didn't take the earpiece. Instead, he stared at the chair, at what it represented. He didn't hate Elon. He didn't worship him either. But he understood him. Understood that what drove Musk wasn't ego for ego's sake, but a deep resentment of being dismissed, of being underestimated, of having billion-dollar ideas met with billion-dollar barriers. And Trump? JDD respected the fight in him, the survival instinct, the ability to read a crowd with the precision of a surgeon. But he also knew the man wanted loyalty like oxygen, not partial, not quiet, but loud, unconditional, and televised. The room ticked in silence. Every second was a message not delivered, a silence being filled by others, anchors, pundits, rival campaigns. Connor spoke again, quieter this time. "If you don't go on air, they'll assume you're picking Elon, even if you say nothing." JD looked at him. "Then maybe nothing's the only honest thing left." Connor didn't try to stop him when JD walked out. Later that night, the silence made headlines. "Where is JD Vance? GOP senator declines to defend Trump against Musk. Speculation grows over Vance's political future after refusal to denounce tech billionaire." No statement, no appearance, no clean soundbite, just absence. And in Washington, absence is never empty. It's a vacuum, one that's filled quickly, by assumption, by spin, by knives waiting for a back. But as JD sat alone hours later in his apartment, the earpiece still untouched in his jacket pocket, he didn't feel regret. He felt clarity. Not every war needed a soldier. Sometimes it needed someone willing to not fire the first shot, even if that silence came at a cost. The studio looked more like a garage than a media hub. Exposed brick, LED strip lights glowing red and blue, and a ceiling fan that buzzed faintly overhead. In the corner, an American flag hung loosely from a repurposed pipe, wrinkled but proud. A thick-smelling candle burned on the table, somewhere between tobacco and vanilla, trying too hard to be both rugged and relatable. JD Vance sat across from the host, Wes Callahan, a former shock jock turned conservative media darling. His podcast, The Foundry, had exploded in the last 2 years, part political theater, part barstool gospel, with a fan base that treated every episode like a battle cry. JD had been on once before. Back then, it was all bourbon and border policy, laughs, applause, a shared language. this time felt different. Wes wore his trademark camo trucker hat and black hoodie. His beard had grown out since last time, more gray than red now. He sipped from a tumbler and leaned back, flashing a grin that felt rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed into the mic, "we've got the man of the hour with us tonight. Senator J.D. Vance, the quiet giant, the Marine with a mission, back on the foundry. And boy, what a week to have you, brother." J.D. offered a polite nod and leaned toward the mic. "Good to be back, Wes." "Let's not waste time," Wes continued, chuckling. "I mean, we could talk about gas prices or trans athletes or whatever else the White House press corps is choking on today. But come on, we all know what folks want to hear." J.D. smiled carefully. "I figured." "All right then," Wes said, tone shifting ever so slightly. "The richest man in the world just accused the 45th president of the United States of being tied to Epstein. No sources, no context, just a digital grenade. And you, J.D., you didn't say a damn thing. No tweet, no post, not even a meme. So let me ask the question the country's been screaming." He leaned in, eyes narrowed, voice quieter now. Not for drama, but for precision. "Are you with Trump or the traitor billionaire?" The studio air didn't change. The lights didn't flicker. But J.D. felt the gravity shift, like a trap door had just clicked into place under his chair. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the producer behind the glass, who looked down the moment their eyes met. Then at Wes, whose grin had vanished, replaced by something colder. Calculating. The friendliness had been foreplay. This was the real show. "I don't traffic in labels," J.D. said, steady, "and I don't call men traitors for asking hard questions." Wes raised his eyebrows theatrically. "You don't call them traitors?" "J.D., come on, that's not asking questions. That's an accusation. And silence from you? That reads loud, my man." J.D. leaned forward. "You want noise? Turn up your mic. You want leadership? Sometimes that comes in the form of not feeding chaos." Wes chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Okay. We're going to talk about that. Stick around, folks. After the break, we're going to ask the senator what he really thinks about Elon's so-called patriotism and why the hell he's the only Republican not taking a swing. The red light on the camera dimmed. J.D. exhaled. Round one had just ended, and he could already feel how far from friendly this table had become. The clip was out less than 2 hours after the show ended. Not the full interview, not the full context. Just 41 seconds, cleanly cut, tightly captioned, and delivered with surgical precision. A talking head on cable played it while the chyron screamed, "J.D. Vance, Elon is a threat to the country." The footage showed J.D. leaning slightly forward, his brow tense, lips compressed in a moment of deep thought. The audio came in halfway through one of his replies. "Look, anyone with that much power, that much reach, and that little accountability is a threat. Full stop cut. Nothing before, nothing after. No mention of nuance. No explanation that J.D. had been referring to systems, not men. That he had followed that line with, which is why we need to be careful how we respond, not just to him, but to what drove him there." None of that made the final cut. What made it was the line, the fire starter. And fire in a media world desperate for fuel doesn't need accuracy. It just needs oxygen. Within minutes, the clip was on X, then Reddit, then Facebook, re-uploaded with cheap music and burning flag backgrounds. Then it landed in group chats J.D. hadn't heard from in years. His phone started buzzing like a broken alarm clock. Jason Miller posted a cryptic thumbs-up emoji. One of Trump's sons reposted the clip with a fire emoji and the words, "He finally gets it." And then, silence. J.D. checked his notifications again. He searched Elon's profile. Nothing. Not a DM, not a follow, not even a tag. He went to message him. Instead, a gray bar appeared. "You can no longer send messages to this user." Blocked. J.D. stared at the screen, thumb hovering over it like he could will it back. Like the algorithm had made a mistake. Like the man who once called him at 1 a.m. to ask if DC was salvageable had just accidentally burned the last bridge between them. Connor entered the room, tablet in hand. "It's everywhere." CNN ran it on a loop. Fox did a segment called Vance Finds His Spine, trending at number 3, hashtag JD flips. JD said nothing. Connor offered gently, "We could put out a clarification. Say it was out of context, that you were talking about institutional power, big tech as a whole." JD looked up. "They don't want clarification. They want sides." He stood, pacing slowly, letting the moment settle over him like wet concrete. Everything he didn't say in that interview had become irrelevant. The edit was the reality now. The world had decided what he meant, and in the absence of context, interpretation had become truth. Connor hesitated. "Do you want me to reach out to Elon?" JD shook his head. "He's already made his judgment." "Then, do we lean in? Use it?" JD paused. There was a part of him, the strategist, the former combatant, the campaign warrior, that knew what Connor meant. Turn the moment, ride the wave, shift into the lane that had just opened for him. But that wasn't why he'd stayed silent. That wasn't why he hadn't taken the shot when he had the mic. "I didn't mean it as a warning," he said quietly. "I meant it as a reflection." Connor nodded, but the news cycle didn't wait for nuance. Outside, the headlines screamed. The base cheered. The digital crowd picked up their pitchforks, some against Elon, others against JD. Inside, JD Vance sat down again, eyes unfocused, replaying every word he had said that night. In a war of images, one sentence had turned him into a symbol, and the man who always measured his words now realized silence isn't safe anymore. The office lights flickered above him, too bright, too sterile, too silent between bursts of chaos. Outside JD Vance's door, phones rang like alarms that never turned off. The press secretary's voice rose, then cut. A printer jammed, then unjammed. Aide after aide paced past his glass wall, trying not to meet his eyes. Inside, JD sat still, his phone face up on the desk. The screen lit up with a headline, "Vance declares Elon Musk a national threat." JD locked the screen. How did one sentence become a war declaration? The air in the room had shifted since morning. By noon, 3 senior staffers had requested personal leave. By 2 o'clock, a speechwriter left a post-it on his chair. "Thank you for everything. You taught me what real loyalty looks like. But I've got 2 kids. I can't be a target." He didn't blame them, not really. The media was flooding in. Politico parked outside. CNN requested an immediate interview. Fox left a voicemail asking for an exclusive apology or clarification. Even The Hill sent someone to document the mood. The mood? It was a funeral wrapped in fluorescent light. Connor entered, his expression stretched thin. "You've got 15 unopened interview requests. Half the office is fielding media questions. And," JD looked up, "and 2 of the PACs want to pause fundraising?" "Because of the clip?" Connor gave a reluctant nod. "They think you picked a side, and not the winning one." JD exhaled slowly. His thumb hovered over his phone again, as if answers could be mined from the glowing screen. The silence from Mar-a-Lago was louder than any tweet, not even a call. Just waiting, as if Trump himself was giving him space to fall further. "What's he saying?" JD asked. Connor didn't flinch. "Nothing. Publicly or privately, which means he's either letting you hang or he's saving the punishment for when it matters more." JD stood up. The motion felt heavier than it should have. He walked to the window, floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the Capitol dome, a view he used to find humbling. Now it felt like a reminder of how high the fall could be. He asked quietly, "Does anyone actually believe I meant it like that?" Connor's reply came carefully. "The ones who matter believe what's useful. The rest, they're just picking teams." JD didn't respond. Instead, he watched a hawk circle above the mall, suspended in the dusk light, like it didn't know the ground was shifting below. There had been a time when he thought words could steer storms, that if you measured every phrase, chose integrity over impulse, the system would reward clarity. But the system had changed. Now clarity wasn't currency. Outrage was. And he had given them the sentence they wanted, just not the meaning they deserved. "Should we release a statement?" Connor asked again. JD turned from the window. "No," he said quietly but firmly. "Not yet. He walked back to his desk, sat, and finally unlocked his phone again. Elon's profile was still blocked. The tweet that started it all still pinned. We should ask why certain names keep showing up next to Epstein's. Power protects power. Below it, 1,000 replies. Most cheering, some questioning, and one anonymous comment that stood out. Even your friends chose the stage over the phone. JD stared at that line for a long time. It wasn't rage that hit him. It was recognition. It was 3:07 in the morning when JD Vance finally sat back down at his desk, the glow of a single lamp casting a soft oval of light across the cluttered wood surface. Outside, Washington slept under a cold, indifferent sky. The Capitol dome loomed quietly in the distance, dimly lit like the ghost of a promise. Inside, the silence was heavy, not oppressive, but thoughtful. JD's pen hovered over a yellow legal pad. Not a keyboard, not a tweet, just ink and silence, and a man too tired to defend himself anymore. This wasn't a statement for the press or a post for the base. It wasn't political strategy. It wasn't damage control. It was a letter, handwritten, unfinished, maybe unread, meant for a man who once called him friend. JD wrote slowly, deliberately. You built rockets when they mocked you, the letter began. Not because they believed in you, but because you refused to let their disbelief define your limits. He paused, then continued. I remember the first time you called me, 12:14 a.m. You said you didn't trust half the people in D.C., but you still wanted to believe someone could fix it. You weren't angry then. You were tired, exhausted from seeing potential wasted in places that never dared to reach orbit. You told me the country felt like a broken engine. Too many gears, none of them moving together. JD stopped again, tapping his pen against the desk. He could still hear Elon's voice, restless, fast, cutting between frustration and fascination, like his mind was always 5 miles ahead of his words. That first conversation had lasted an hour and 22 minutes. JD had written down 3 words afterward, restless but loyal. And now? Now he didn't know who he was writing to anymore. He returned to the page. You once said legacy wasn't money or code or even Mars. It was whether people could still dream out loud without being laughed at. You believe that. I did too. He didn't write the next sentence aloud. He only whispered it in the back of his mind. What happened to that man? JD scratched the side of his hand. Ink smudged slightly where his palm dragged across the page. He could feel the exhaustion settling in behind his eyes, but sleep felt impossible. Too many headlines, too many voices, and none of them his own. He continued, I didn't go on that show to betray you. I went because I thought silence would be worse. I tried to thread the needle, tried to speak without stabbing, but I forgot how little oxygen nuance gets in this world. And now, here we are. He drew a line under the last paragraph. Not the end, just a pause. Across the room, his phone vibrated. He didn't move. Not yet. The silence felt like a gift. He looked back at the letter. For a moment, JD didn't see Elon as the icon, the lightning rod, the one-word headline. He saw the man who once joked about building a quiet house on the moon just to think clearly again. A man who, somewhere along the way, had stopped calling at midnight, not because he was too busy, but because the noise had gotten louder than the friendship. JD let out a long breath and signed the bottom. No title, no closing line, just his name. The rest, he figured, would either be understood or never matter. As he folded the page, he whispered to no one in particular, You wanted more for this country. I still believe that. I hope wherever you are tonight, you remember it too. The letter still sat on JD's desk, folded neatly but unsent, as the memory crept in without permission. It came not as a sharp recollection, but as a slow wave, warm, humming, metallic. He was back inside the Tesla Gigafactory, not the polished boardroom, not the media-ready test track, but the actual floor, where sparks danced in the air, where boots thudded against concrete, where men and women spoke in exhausted voices, but held something in their eyes he hadn't seen in Washington. Belief. He remembered the air first. It smelled of sweat and battery coolant and something else. Maybe hope wrapped in metal and exhaustion. Elon hadn't walked with a camera crew that day. No fanfare. Just him, JD, and a small clipboard. They'd moved from station to station, Elon pausing to greet each worker by name. Not all of them, of course, but enough to matter. One young woman with grease on her cheek had looked at JD with wide eyes and said, "He changed my life, not with a tweet, with this job, with the dream." JD had nodded politely back then, but now her words circled like birds above memory. The dream. Whose dream had it become? He remembered one older mechanic, arms like steel cables, pausing mid-well to tell him, "I don't care if he's weird. The man shows up. Can't say that for most suits." JD had smiled, half proud, half stung. It was one of the few times he'd felt the line blur between innovation and working-class grit. The factory didn't feel like Silicon Valley. It felt like Ohio with robots, like ambition in steel-toe boots. Back then, Elon had still carried that fire, the kind you didn't light on Twitter, but in people. He spoke about speed not just in seconds per charge, but in urgency for a better country. "We're not waiting for Washington," he'd said. "We're just building around it." JD had believed him, maybe still did. But as he sat in his quiet office now, the memory had grown heavier. Those same workers, what were they thinking tonight? As tweets flared and news segments rehashed the feud like Bloodsport, JD feared the belief that once ran down those factory lines had changed shape. Was it still conviction, or had it hardened into something else? Resentment, maybe? Rage pretending to be purpose? He could still hear the echo of machinery, the shouted jokes between line crews, the hissing press of hydraulics shaping metal into something that promised a future. It had felt honest, grounded, even sacred, not like DC, where the shape of things changed by the hour, and loyalty was a currency always losing value. JD leaned back in his chair and whispered to no one. They didn't clock in for culture wars. They clocked in to build something real. That was the part no headline could capture. The Tesla workers didn't follow Elon because he was loud. They followed him because he aimed at the stars and somehow made that feel like a shift they could work. And now, as factions formed and insults hardened into party lines, JD wondered if the noise had finally drowned the mission, if the fire on the factory floor had been traded for fireworks online. He rubbed his eyes, the lines on his forehead deeper than they had been 6 months ago. Not from politics, from grief. Grief for what it felt like they were all losing. A quiet voice inside him asked the question he'd been avoiding. What if this isn't just about two men anymore? What if it's about what people believe leadership looks like now, and whether they'll ever believe in something quiet again? He didn't have an answer, just the hum of a distant factory, replaying in his mind like an old song. The house was quiet now, save for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of old wooden beams settling into the night. JD sat at his desk, the final lines of the letter still fresh in his mind, though the ink had long dried. He read them once more in silence. You built rockets when they mocked you. You wanted more for this country. There was more. Thoughts he had folded between paragraphs, pauses he knew Elon would understand if he ever read it. But JD knew he wouldn't send it. Not because he didn't mean every word, but because meaning something wasn't the same as changing something. Not anymore. He picked up the envelope, held it under the lamplight, then slowly reached for the worn black Bible that sat on the edge of his bookshelf. It wasn't for display. He had carried that Bible since law school, its corners frayed, its pages soft and familiar. He opened it to the middle, past the underlined verses, and gently slid the letter between 2 pages of Ecclesiastes. A time to speak and a time to be silent, he whispered to himself. It felt like both. Truth didn't always need a podium, or a press release, or a quote tweet. Sometimes it needed only to be spoken once, and then remembered by the right person at the right moment. JD let his fingers rest on the page a little longer before closing the Bible, the weight of the folded paper now tucked inside it, like a secret he wasn't hiding, just protecting. He sat back and let the silence fill the room again. A part of him knew this letter wasn't for Elon. Not really, it was for himself. For the version of him that still believed that disagreements didn't have to mean destruction, That legacy wasn't who shouted the loudest, but who held on to their compass when everyone else traded theirs for a flag. This wasn't about taking sides in a feud. It was about remembering the man Elon had been before the spotlight bent him out of shape, before the noise drowned out the mission. He thought again of that factory floor, the people who believed in something larger than themselves, the girl with grease on her cheek, the old welder who didn't care if Elon was weird. They didn't need more fights. They needed more futures. But futures didn't trend. Rage did. JD looked at his phone again. Over 80 million impressions on the clip that twisted his words. Over 300,000 comments. And none of them would ever see this letter. And maybe that was okay. He turned off the lamp and stood up slowly. His body ached, not from age, but from something harder to name. Fatigue of the spirit, perhaps. He walked over to the window and looked out at the stillness of the street below. The Capitol dome stood faint in the distance, backlit by the city's amber glow. It looked peaceful from here, almost noble, but JD knew better. Inside that building, the knives were already drawn. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more heat, more pressure to choose between loyalty and clarity. But not tonight. Tonight, the truth was folded into a book, not broadcasted to the world. And somehow that felt more powerful. Because there are moments in history when restraint says more than rebuttal. When choosing silence isn't surrender, it's stewardship. JD breathed in, slow and deep, then whispered into the dark, because sometimes truth isn't meant to be retweeted, just remembered. And with that, he turned away from the window and walked back into the quiet. 3 days after the letter was folded into his Bible, J.D. Vance stood at Gate 18 of Reagan National Airport, waiting for a flight that wasn't on his original schedule. The invitation had come unexpectedly from a student leadership council at a Texas Tech university known more for its engineering prowess than political engagement. The subject line had been simple: leadership and loyalty in divided times. The message was earnest, even handwritten. The students wanted JD to speak not as a politician, but as someone caught between titans, someone who hadn't screamed back. He almost declined, but something about the quiet honesty of the request pulled at him. Maybe it was the way the student described their campus: diverse, divided, disillusioned. Maybe it was the line that read, "Most of us don't know who to believe anymore, but we still want to believe in something." So JD booked a ticket and asked his staff to keep it off the press radar. No headlines, just a conversation. That's what he told himself. When he arrived on campus, the air smelled like warm stone and new ideas. Students buzzed around in sweatshirts and sneakers, phones out, earbuds in. But they looked up when JD passed. Some stopped, some whispered, some recorded. The clip of him allegedly calling Elon a threat to the country had gone viral. Even here, far from DC, the fallout had followed him. He felt it in the sideways glances, in the tension behind some of the smiles. The student who had written the invitation, Maya Patel, met him at the quad entrance. She was sharp, composed, no more than 20, and had a spiral notebook full of scribbled questions. "We're grateful you came," she said. "Some of the others we invited declined." JD nodded. "I've been on that side of the email. I understand." The auditorium was modest, more lecture hall than grand stage. Maybe 150 students filled the seats, some clearly political junkies, others just curious or restless. The walls were lined with tech posters, coding competitions, and flyers about artificial intelligence ethics. JD stood behind the podium with no teleprompter, no staffer in sight. "I wasn't supposed to be here," he began, voice steady but low. "Not just today. Here in this moment, caught between people I admire who now seem determined to destroy each other." The room quieted. Even the students looking at their phones began to glance up. He talked not about campaigns or polls, but about complexity, about being raised in a broken town where people trusted their gut more than any politician. He spoke about Elon, not the man trending on social media, but the man who once called him late at night, asking if JD thought America still had the courage to build things. He spoke about Trump, not as a brand, but as a human being with volcanic instincts and a hunger to be heard. "I've been asked to pick a side," JD said, pausing. And maybe some of you feel like you're being asked to do the same. To reduce your voice to one button, one banner, one side of a meme. He looked around the room and saw something shift. Eyes met his, arms uncrossed. A few pens moved. But here's the truth, he continued. Loyalty isn't silence, and leadership isn't performance. You can love someone's vision and still question their judgment. You can respect their past and still fear their future. The students didn't clap at first. They just listened, and that was enough. When the talk ended, Maya handed him a sealed envelope. Something for the flight back, she said. JD tucked it into his coat pocket, nodded in thanks, and walked outside into the Texas evening. The sky was wide. The noise for once had receded. The room had mostly emptied, but a few students lingered near the edge of the stage, waiting for a handshake or a selfie, or simply the courage to speak. JD Vance remained at the podium, thumb tracing the edge of the envelope Maya had given him earlier. The energy in the room had shifted. It wasn't confrontation anymore. It was contemplation. Just as JD stepped down from the low platform, a voice cut through the quiet. "Sir, may I ask something?" It came from the back row. The student was standing alone, half in shadow, clutching a notebook to his chest like a shield. He looked maybe 19, nervous but not hostile. JD gestured for him to continue. The student's voice shook slightly as he asked, "If both of them, Elon and Trump, are wrong, what should someone like me do?" You could feel the silence harden. This wasn't a challenge. It wasn't bait. It was something more dangerous. Honesty. JD didn't answer right away. He stepped slowly to the edge of the stage and looked directly at the young man, not past him. He could feel the question pull at every unsent letter in his pocket, every unsaid sentence in his career. "I think," JD began, choosing his words with care, "you don't choose idols, you choose ideas, and you protect the ones that survive fire." The student blinked, unsure whether that was metaphor or instruction. JD pressed forward, letting the stillness of the room shape his words. "Men will fail you," he said, "even the ones who once inspired you. They'll grow reckless or proud or angry. And if all you've built your beliefs on is a man's name, when that name falls, your belief goes with it." He paused. "But if you choose ideas, freedom, accountability, ambition without cruelty, those things can stand without a name, without a platform, without a spotlight." Some students had started to sit back down. Others stopped mid-scroll on their phones. You could sense they weren't just listening, they were thinking. JD stepped down fully from the stage and walked slowly toward the back row. "You asked what someone like you should do," he said, voice lower now. "You should doubt loudly, learn quietly, and build something that doesn't need a billionaire's permission to matter." He smiled just slightly. "And if you're lucky, maybe someday the people shouting the loudest will be quoting you." The student gave a tiny nod, eyes wide. JD didn't need applause to know the answer had landed. As he turned to leave, a second student, not the one who asked, called out softly, "Did they ever say sorry? Either of them?" JD stopped. For a long second, he said nothing. Then gently, "Power doesn't say sorry, but it remembers who stayed calm when everyone else was on fire." He stepped out into the hallway. The air was cooler now. The noise of campus life returned, but softer, like something had shifted. Not because of a dramatic speech or a viral quote, but because someone in the back row asked what mattered most. And someone answered. The moment wasn't supposed to go viral. There were no sound bites, no shouting matches, no grandstanding. Just a simple question asked from the back of the room, and an answer given without armor. But someone had recorded it. A girl in the fourth row, phone angled just right. No filters, no edits. Just JD's voice, calm and deliberate, responding to a student's trembling honesty with a line that landed in silence. "You don't choose idols. You choose ideas, and you protect the ones that survive fire." By morning, the clip had nearly 900,000 views. It wasn't trending on outrage hashtags. It didn't spike because someone got humiliated. It rose because, for once, someone said something that sounded more like a journal entry than a political tactic. Under the post, the comments didn't spiral into chaos. they whispered. Parents tagged their kids. Veterans reposted it with one-word captions like "finally" or "this." A high school teacher from Ohio wrote, "I'm showing this in civics class today." JD didn't know any of that yet. He was in a borrowed office near the Austin airport, sipping burnt coffee from a conference mug that said "Tech for Liberty." His aide had mentioned the clip, but JD hadn't seen it. Didn't really want to. Then his phone rang. It was a number with no name. Not from a network or campaign or DC office. Just a Kentucky area code. JD hesitated, then picked up. "Senator Vance?" the voice asked, rough but polite. "Yes." "This is probably weird," the man continued. "I'm the overnight janitor at the university you spoke at yesterday. I was cleaning the back hallway near the stage." JD listened quietly. "My son's a sophomore there," the man said. "Wants to study engineering. Was losing interest. He's been saying lately that everything's corrupt or fake or, scripted." His word. JD nodded faintly, even though the man couldn't see. "He was there last night," the man added. "He's the one who asked the question from the back." That stopped JD. He sat forward in his chair. "He came home and told me he'd never heard a politician admit that people fail you, or that it's okay to protect ideas even when heroes fall." There was a long pause on the line. "I just wanted to say," the man finished, voice catching slightly, "you made my son think again. Not vote, not cheer, just think." JD looked out the window, the phone pressed gently to his ear. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full. "Thank you for telling me that," JD said softly. "That means more than you know." The call ended. No follow-up, no invitation, no need. He didn't text anyone, didn't post, didn't retweet the clip. He just sat still for a while, thinking about the strange, quiet power of a moment that wasn't meant for headlines, and yet had become a kind of antidote to them. Later, when his aide came in, holding up the now viral clip on her phone, JD smiled but waved it away. "I already heard the best part," he said, and he meant it. The ballroom was dim, private, and painfully quiet. Heavy velvet drapes muffled the sound of passing traffic outside the Summit Hotel. Inside, the chairs were arranged in precise arcs. One circle for the press, another for security, and a tighter, smaller one for those whose names didn't need name tags. That's where JD sat, 2 rows behind the main table. No placard, no spotlight, just presence. He hadn't planned on being there. In fact, he'd asked not to be. But someone had insisted his attendance would be reassuring. Reassuring to whom, he wasn't told. The moment was brief but heavy. For the first time since the fallout, since that tweet detonated months of political tension like a buried landmine, the 2 most watched men in America were back in the same room, and they didn't look at each other. Donald Trump sat on the right, arms crossed, lips tight, eyes cold. A stack of papers in front of him remained untouched. His tie was slightly crooked, a detail his aides usually fixed but must have missed today. Elon Musk sat opposite. No papers, no entourage. Just him and a glass of water, which he didn't touch. He wore black. Not a suit, but something sharper. His face unreadable. His posture relaxed, but unnervingly still. They weren't here to debate. They weren't here to reconcile. They were here, according to the summit's vague agenda, to discuss long-term technology collaboration and American innovation. But the topic was irrelevant. Everyone knew this wasn't about policy. This was about the room. JD didn't blink. He didn't move. He didn't breathe too loudly. From where he sat, he could see the tension rise and fall in the shoulders of everyone nearby. Advisors shifting in their seats. Cameras waiting silently. Reporters pretending not to take notes. It was the quietest chaos JD had ever witnessed. At one point, a moderator asked a question about AI ethics. Trump answered first. Direct, aggressive, dismissive. Elon followed. Calm, technical, abstract. Their words didn't overlap, but their tones collided in midair. JD knew that collision well. He'd lived inside it for weeks. What struck him wasn't the content of what they said, but what they didn't say. No mention of the tweet. No apology, no accusation. It was as if the blast never happened, as if the crater didn't exist, as if pretending silence was a strategy. not a symptom. Then Elon glanced up just for a second, not at Trump, at the room, scanning it like a camera. JD thought he caught his eye, but couldn't be sure. The gaze moved on. No nod, no recognition, just movement. Trump didn't look at Elon once. Not during the panel, not during the handshakes after, not even as he exited. JD stayed seated until both men were gone. The air was still thick with what hadn't been said. He wondered if anyone else felt it. That strange pressure, like watching two titans share a battlefield, only to walk opposite directions, pretending it had never been one. Later, when reporters asked him for comment, JD just said, "Sometimes leadership means knowing when not to add noise." He didn't clarify what he meant. He didn't need to, because if you sat in that room, you already knew. The summit was nearing its end. The agenda had been drained of relevance an hour ago, and yet no one in the room dared to rise first. Even the moderator, a seasoned diplomat used to managing power-packed egos, had resorted to gently repeating phrases like, "Appreciate your presence," and "constructive dialogue." But everyone knew what they were waiting for. It wasn't another speech. It wasn't another tweet. It was something quieter and far more combustible. Elon was already on his feet. He hadn't said much during the second half, just a few clipped responses about infrastructure autonomy and AI sovereignty. Trump had remained seated, scribbling on the edge of his notes but saying nothing. The silence between them had grown so loud it pressed against the walls. Then came the moment no one was prepared to interpret. Elon stepped forward, not toward the media, not toward the moderator, but toward Trump. Not fast, not slow, no bravado. Just a man walking 12 feet across a carpeted floor as if it meant nothing. Trump saw it. Everyone saw it. For a split second, time stretched. Elon didn't speak. He didn't raise a hand. He simply stopped in front of Trump's chair. The room froze. Cameras didn't flash. Reporters didn't murmur. The staff didn't breathe. JD Vance, sitting where he could see both men in profile, suddenly felt his chest tighten, not from anxiety but anticipation. Trump looked up. What passed between them in that glance could fill volumes. Not forgiveness, not surrender, recognition maybe, or something older than either of them wanted to admit. Then Trump stood. No podium, no note card, no rally voice, just a nod. And then, without a single word, they shook hands. There was no press release, no microphone surge, no triumphant score playing underneath, just skin meeting skin, 1 second, maybe 2. Then it was done. The room didn't clap, it exhaled. JD's throat burned, not with emotion, but with restraint. He watched the handshake end, the men turn away from each other like they hadn't just rewritten a headline that would never be published. Elon walked out without another word. Trump sat back down and adjusted his cufflinks. That was it. No closure, no caption. Just a moment that would live only in the memory of the people who were there. JD reached for the pen in his coat pocket, the same pen he used to scribble thoughts when the world refused to explain itself. He didn't write a speech. He just jotted one line on the back of the summit agenda. Not everything true needs to be televised. As he stood to leave, an aide leaned over and asked, "Do we need to get ahead of this, sir? Control the narrative?" JD looked back at the room, now emptying like the air had been let out of it. "No," he replied quietly. "Let this one drift. If it mattered, it won't disappear." Later that night, the news cycle ran wild with speculation. They argued over body language, timing, lighting angles. Some networks claimed it happened. Others said it was a hoax. None had footage. No one had audio. Just rumors and one out of focus still from the far corner of the room. But for those who were there, no filter, no spin, it was enough. Because sometimes history doesn't shout. It simply nods, then walks away. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet for a building that had just held two of the most polarizing men in American public life under the same roof. JD walked without hurry, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting, the weight of the last hour settling in. Not heavy, not triumphant, just final. There was no applause, no press cluster chasing him down the corridor, just the soft rustle of paper as a staffer tucked away leftover agendas and emptied water glasses on silver trays. He didn't wait for a car. didn't check his phone. His aide caught up to him near the side exit, confused, almost breathless. "Sir, you're just leaving?" JD turned, offering a slight, worn-out smile. "Yeah, but you fixed it. You helped cool the fire, at least for now. Don't you think you should say something? Even just a few words? People need to know." He paused at the door, one hand resting on the worn brass handle, the other still in his coat pocket where he'd stuffed that crumpled note from earlier. A beat passed, then another, and then he said it, softly, with the kind of weight that doesn't try to impress, only to be understood. "Because sometimes, silence is the only headline I need." The aide didn't reply. What could he say? Outside, the wind had picked up. DC at night was always strange, less chaotic, more honest. Without cameras, people walked differently. JD stepped out into the cool air. No convoy, no flashing lights, just a man in a coat, fading into a city that never truly sleeps, but sometimes forgets to look up. A car eventually arrived. Not a black SUV, just a regular sedan. He got in quietly, looked once back at the building, and then forward again. Not to admire the skyline, but to move on. He didn't post anything that night, didn't give a follow-up interview, didn't leak a quote to Axios or send a one-line text to Fox. And no one, not Trump, not Elon, ever said thank you. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe they thought this was JD doing what he was supposed to do: patch, protect, pacify. But JD wasn't thinking about that. His mind was somewhere else, on a factory floor in Fremont, on a debate stage in Ohio, on a kitchen table in Kentucky with his mother trying to explain to him that sometimes the loudest people in the room have nothing left to say. And the ones who stay quiet, sometimes they're the ones holding it all together. As the city disappeared behind him, he closed his eyes, leaned back, and let the silence stretch. It didn't demand attention. It didn't need translation. It was enough. The frame was ordinary. No gilded edge, no spotlight, no placard. Just a square of glass holding a single printed tweet, Elon's, the one that had threatened to split the country in half. The one that had poured gasoline onto a flame already burning under every political conversation in America. It was printed in grayscale, stark, almost like a document in a case file. But what made it striking was the thick, deliberate red line crossing through the center of it. Not scribbled, not vandalized, marked. As if someone wanted to make a point, not erase history, but reckon with it. Beneath the frame, mounted just below eye level on a small wooden strip, were 6 etched words. This almost ruined a nation. Visitors to JD's Senate office paused when they saw it. Some were silent, some whispered. A few asked what it meant. JD never answered directly. He gestured to the frame, let them look longer and say, "What do you think it means?" In time, aides stopped asking. The cleaning staff began wiping it like it was sacred. Even lobbyists, hardened by years of spin and scandal, seemed to stand a little straighter in that room. It wasn't just a reminder of what was said. It was a memory of what didn't happen, what JD refused to let happen. The collapse, the retaliation, the chaos that could have burned trust to ash. The tweet had once gone viral for the wrong reasons. Now it stayed preserved for the right ones. And though JD rarely explained his choice, once during a closed-door mentoring session with interns, he offered this: "Some legacies aren't medals or monuments. They're the fires you put out that no one ever sees." A brown envelope came through the Senate mailroom with no return address. Inside, 5 neatly stapled pages of wide-ruled notebook paper. At the top, in blue ink, a title: "Why JD Vance is the only politician I trust." JD opened it slowly, expecting sarcasm or satire, but line by line it wasn't mockery, it was earnest. Written by a high school senior from rural Ohio named Miguel H., the essay told a quiet story of a boy whose dad watched political clips on YouTube, who didn't believe anyone in DC meant what they said anymore. Until the night Miguel saw JD answer a student's question at a university, not with spin, but with stillness. Miguel wrote, "I didn't agree with everything he said, but he didn't treat the question like a grenade. He treated it like it mattered." He talked about how his civics class watched that clip the next day, how their teacher replayed JD's words, You don't choose idols. You choose ideas, and you protect the ones that survive fire. Miguel said that one line had made him rethink what leadership really meant. It's not who yells best. It's who listens when everyone else is yelling. JD sat with that letter for a long time. No cameras, no notes to draft. He folded it, slowly, and tucked it into the same drawer where he kept his mother's first paycheck stub and a ribbon from the Marine he met during his first campaign trail. That night, long after the lights in the building dimmed, JD whispered aloud to no one. One voice. That's all it ever takes. The event wasn't public. No live stream. Just rows of veterans in folding chairs beneath a community center's flickering lights. No one expected JD to speak. He was just there to observe, shake hands, maybe pose for one or two respectful photos. But near the end, he walked to the front, pulled a folded sheet from his pocket, unfolded it once, then again. I never sent this, he began, but maybe it was never meant to be sent. Maybe it was meant to be said. The letter was to Elon, dated weeks back, the night after the tweet. He didn't read it in anger. He read it like someone trying to remember a friend who had been more than what people saw now. You built rockets when they mocked you, he read. You stayed up when the nation wanted to sit down. You believed in the impossible until you believed in vengeance instead. Silence in the room. JD kept going. His voice didn't crack. It got quieter. Between power and pride, he said, finishing the final line. I chose country. I hope you will too. He folded the letter back into his jacket pocket. No applause followed, just a long breath shared by a room full of men and women who knew what it meant to fight. Later, one of the veterans approached him. You didn't have to read that, she said. JD just nodded. I know, but I needed to hear it out loud, even if he never does. Outside, the stars were out, unretweetable, unfiltered, just quietly burning. This story isn't just about politics. It's about the invisible weight of influence, the cost of silence, and the strength it takes to walk between giants without becoming one. J.D. Vance isn't portrayed as a flawless hero, but as a man trying to stay human in a world that rewards noise over nuance. The unsent letter, the framed warning, and the essay from a student. These aren't dramatic acts, but lasting ones. They remind us that sometimes the most powerful choices are made off camera. In an age of instant reactions, this story invites us to ask, what if legacy isn't about being loud, but about being lasting? What about you? Have you ever made a choice that no one saw, but still shaped who you are? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.